Without a doubt, one of the most beloved tactical RTS games of all time is Commandos. But there is another strong pretender to this title, a different series made by the studio known as Spellbound. Hi, I'm Chris, and today we'll take an in-depth look at Desperados, Wanted Dead or Alive, Robin Hood Legend of Sherwood, and Chicago 1930. Three games that took the core elements from Commandos and managed to put their own unique spin on them. What's even more interesting is that these games not only differ in substantial ways from the Commandos series, but more incredibly, they differ between each other, which is an exceedingly difficult feat to pull off. Without further ado, let's dive right in. But before we do that, a word of warning. I will talk about some specific story beats, so expect spoilers. And yes, I know that the basic construction for each one of these games, including Commandos, is virtually the same. But as always, the devil is in the details. It just goes to show you how different people given the same ingredients can produce significantly different works. It is immediately apparent that the adventures produced by Spellbound aren't mere copies of Commandos, but that they evolved the formula and iterated on it. But as far as the basics are concerned, you get a handful of specialists, each with his or hers unique talents and abilities. And then in each mission you are presented with a puzzle of sorts. How to navigate, distract or outright eliminate the enemies on your way to the mission objective. The fun thing is that there are a vast amount of approaches available to you to solve the puzzle. So much so that there is a great possibility that no two players will finish any given level in the same way using the same tactics. Which is, at least to me, actually a funny thing. I was always under the impression that the game somehow funnels you to using some obvious tactics. How wrong I was made abundantly clear to me when I watched a few gameplays on YouTube. There were some moves and abilities that I didn't even thought of using in any given situation, but other people used them to great effect. For example, I never thought of using Kate's mirror not only as a blinding tool, but also as a means of luring enemies to my current position. Not to mention its ability to light gunpowder on fire. Which actually meant that I rarely used it, or never in fact. But when I saw that I could use the mirror to lure out enemies, it opened up a whole new area of possibilities during play. I think that after finishing each level, the path I took somehow ingrained itself in my mind as the one and true clear way to complete a mission. So much so that I didn't even search for different approaches on my subsequent playthroughs. Only thanks to YouTube I found out how strong these games are in the multitude of approaches available to the player. But that's enough talking about the basics. Let's dive right into the first game, Desperados, Wanted Dead or Alive. And according to me, which admittedly is a very subjective perspective, this game was the very best western up until Red Dead Redemption. It has almost all of the great western staples, apart from the gunfight at high noon in the town's center. With a total of 25 missions, there is ample room for stealing horses, assaulting a bandit hideout, an ambush in a canyon, or even a run with the law that went sideways at El Paso. But let's begin at the beginning, with John Cooper, the game's main character, and his mission to catch whoever is responsible for some major train robberies. But to do that, he first needs to find some helping hands. Because bringing down a whole gang is hard work and may be a bit too much for him to handle on his own. Which leads me neatly to one of the most enjoyable parts of the game, at least for me, namely the building of a team. And although the game has 6 playable characters in total, only John, Doc, Sam and Kate are part of the core squad. The last 2, that is Sanchez and Mia, are somewhat accidental additions to the team, but not in any way less important or useful. Especially Sanchez is a great member of the team, and not only in his posture, but also with the ability to carry 2 bodies, or even clean out an occupied building out of enemies. Not to mention his long-range stone throw, which is a godsend in many encounters. But be it as it may, each character is a valued and valuable member of the team, and in stark contrast to the Commandos series, they actually have a personality. At least in contrast to the first 2 Commandos games, in which I didn't get much in terms of character for my soldiers, apart from their voice work, on which most of my inferences regarding their personality were based in these early installments, which in actuality is not that much. In Desperados, Spellbound made it abundantly clear that each team member has something to say, and that they don't have to like each other very much either. Doc and Sam spring to mind right from the get-go. Simply put, there is actual dialogue between the members of John's team, and even an overarching storyline between missions. And yes, I know that in itself isn't in any way groundbreaking when it comes to games, but it was a great improvement when it comes to the tactical RTS type. Finally, I had a comprehensive story and not only a number of missions that were episodic at their core. And don't get me wrong, in Commandos the missions themselves were great, especially in the expansion pack. But adding a storyline and conversations between teammates was a great idea that gave not only something to look forward to, but also provided context to why the team was where it was, and most importantly, gave meaning to what they were doing. And this approach would persist through all 3 games, and even wrap off on the subsequent installments of the Commandos series, to a point where now it is the norm, not an exception. But I remember the first time I played it, and what a colossal improvement that was. And the characters themselves had honest-to-God actual dialogue lines. And the performance of the voice actors was also great. To be honest, half the fun of this and the next game is listening to what the characters have to say. Especially because they included some interesting dynamics between them. So, let's talk a bit about these dynamics. The first character, and arguably the most important one, is John Cooper. He's the one with the plan. Think Hannibal Smith from A-Team, but in the Wild West. It seems that everyone respects and listens to John, and they never question his decisions. Well, almost never. The one exception being breaking into Fortezza, but that particular map will come up shortly. There is also the team's reaction when Mia wants to join. It's natural and even somewhat realistic. They don't want to put her in harm's way, but ultimately decide that she can handle herself and is welcomed in. Actually, due to the fact that she is still a kid, everyone is very protective of Mia, till the very end, especially Sanchez and Kate, and this concern for her is coming up frequently in conversations, so I really felt that they care for her safety, even if at the point of her joining they were basically a band of outlaws fighting with the marshal and whatnot. There is a concrete dynamic between each and every character, making them not only unique, but also their interactions with others quite distinct. Take for example Sam and Doc McCoy. These two are butting heads from the very beginning. It's easy to tell that neither of them holds the other one in high regard, but by the time I reached the game's climax, those two have grown to respect each other. They still weren't friends, but somewhat of an, let's say, professional respect clearly developed between them. And their constant back and forward during the McCoy training mission was one of the most funny dialogue chains in the whole game. In fact, I was so interested what each of those characters has to say that in the Escape from El Paso mission, where I had to gather the gang after everything went belly up, I took every character to inform each other about what is happening. Let me explain a bit. I started the mission only with John, while the rest of the team was scattered somewhere across town. I had to find them and tell them what's happening. So for example, I first went for Sam, and then took Sam to inform Doc and Kate. Next I loaded the safe and went for Doc to let him inform Sam and Kate. Lastly, I did the same for Kate. Of course, the most dialogue was reserved for John, but I was very interested what each of them would say, and even if it wasn't much, they all had their own approach. But there is still one rather interesting thing concerning the characters' personalities. And that's their weapons. You see, each team member has his or her own personal gun, with the exception of Mia, but I will get to her in a bit. Cooper, as the leader and quintessential cowboy bounty hunter, has of course a 6-shooter revolver, a fast and reliable weapon, great in close quarters. Sam, the demolition expert, required something with a longer range, but not as fast. A Winchester, great for taking out enemies at a distance. Then there is Doc's buntline, a deadly accurate weapon, with decent range but low rate of fire. Something very well suited for a doctor. Some might say that this gun is very surgical, especially if fitted with a scope. Kate has a easily concealable Derringer with only 3 shots. This one is rather something used as a last resort rather than a reliable means of dispatching enemies, as Kate herself would rather rely on deception and her wit rather than a gun. The last weapon is Sanchez's shotgun, capable of killing multiple enemies in one shot. Very blunt and very deadly, just like its owner. It may have only 2 shots, but if used correctly, it will decimate an entire enemy group in mere moments. The last one is Mia. As she is just a kid, she doesn't have a gun, but rather a blowpipe with just 1 shot. But the devastation it can cause is leagues and bounds above even Sanchez's shotgun, as the enemy hit with the dart will go into a state of frenzy and will attack everyone around him, and if he survives, he will be knocked out at the end. This ability alone allowed me to clean out whole regions of the map without any problem. And just like Mia herself, her weapon is small, silent, and above all else, its looks are very deceiving. Taking all that into account, I would say that each gun or blowpipe is not only a weapon, but a representation of any given team member's character traits and demeanor. And as we are on the topic of guns, allow me to talk a bit about the shooting mechanics, because they are quite interesting and definitely different than the ones found in the Commandos series. Each enemy, or Cooper's team member for that matter, has a set amount of health points. The tougher enemies have more, of course. This matters a lot if you want to shoot someone from afar with the Winchester or buntline. Each shot, if it hits, deals a greatly reduced amount of damage on count of the distance. It sometimes can become a war of attrition of sorts, trying to weather the enemy's HP down to 0 before he does the same to you. But if you find yourself in close quarters, the amount of health points is utterly irrelevant. One revolver shot at close range can kill anyone. And after playing Commandos, this was a surprising twist, because in the aforementioned series, each shot, no matter the distance, always dealt the same amount of damage. The only limitation was the weapon's range. The possibility, or even certainty, of an instant kill made me much more reluctant to rush into a gunfight. It's true that my bullets were equally deadly, but if I missed, it would most certainly end with the death of one or more of my team members. Due to that, I started to search for alternative approaches, rather than going in guns blazing. But there is one more thing that prevents the overuse of guns, and that is the fact that they can and will easily overheat if used continuously, as well as the need for reloading after the bullets run dry, although the overall amount of bullets is infinite. But to be honest, the most interesting thing becomes obvious when it comes to shotguns and Gatling guns. At least to me it was interesting. Long accustomed by Commandos that machine guns are easily avoidable if my commando was running, as the bullets impacted in a lightly arched line on the ground, the bullet randomness of a Gatling gun or shotgun in Desperados shocked me, as it was nearly unavoidable, making the acquisition of a Gatling gun a highlight of every mission in which it is present. Especially if Sanchez is in the team, as he can pick it up and make it mobile, turning him into a whirlwind of bullets and destruction. The shotgun bullets, or pellets, function in much the same way, albeit with a far lower speed and magazine capacity. And yes, I know that this shotgun doesn't have a magazine to talk about, but you get the point. And as we are talking about the shotgun, one little thing as a side note. I did sometimes prepare an ambush by lining my team behind the corner of a building and then waiting patiently for the enemies to come running, as most of the time 4 bullets were more than enough to finish off even the hardest opponents. This in itself was a sound enough strategy, but after Sanchez joined the team I tried it again, and many times my carefully lined up team died with no apparent reason as soon as the enemy rounded around the corner. You can't even begin to realize how long it took me to find out that this sudden death wasn't due to an abnormally fast gunslinger in the enemy's ranks, but to my own lack of foresight. It turns out that I put Sanchez at the end of the line instead of the front, and you can imagine what his shotgun did to my team when placed at the wrong end of the line. I simply assumed that the bullets would just appear in the designated area. But not only is there a logical spread for this weapon, the game also takes into account any obstacle in its path, which was for me at that time an astonishing realization, but a very welcome one. I guess I just didn't expect Spellbound to put so much attention to a mechanic that by the game's very nature would be used rather sparingly. So with that out of the way, I think it's enough when it comes to the gun mechanics. Let's focus now on something else, something that I already mentioned, on why the team building part of this game was my favorite one. The answer is quite simple. The recruitment of each new member consists basically of 2 missions. One where they are rescued, and then a smaller one where I was able to find out what their abilities were and how to use them. It's true, these missions are heavily scripted and don't allow much in the way of available approaches, but they also have a ton of character development. And well, finding out what the new teammate can do was also incredibly satisfying. In addition, the rescue missions themselves have loads of variety, in terms of how I was introduced to the newest member. Sam was knocked out cold by goons on a plantation, Doug was about to be hanged, which is always fun, Kate was caught cheating and imprisoned on a steamboat. But Sanchez? Yeah, he also had to be broken out, freed from the most fortified prison around, which was in some minor way my fault in the first place. Only Mia didn't need to be rescued. She actually helped out John, Sam and Sanchez in a pinch. The fun of getting to know them and discovering what they can do is very captivating, even after I played Desperados to completion many times. I still, to this day, remember the excitement after I finally went home from work in the fields, and yes, I grew up on a farm, to find out and discover that Sam is in a very hostile labor dispute, that Doug is about to be hanged, or that in a few short moments I will have to assault the most fortified prison in the region. That and the gorgeous mission maps seared themselves into my mind and never really left. It was some kind of perfect storm of game and real-world collision that allowed me to play Desperados in the height of summer during the harvest, as one of the first missions is placed on a plantation, another during a small town fair, or in a hacienda outside town under the blistering sun. All this allowed the visuals to sink their teeth into me even stronger than usual. If I could recommend to anyone a time to play Desperados, it would be in the middle of a sunny summer, during the harvest time when you see work being done in the fields. It's a much more visceral way of experiencing the game, at least for me it was. And yes, I know that there is much of my personal nostalgia in that. But be it as it may, there is still something else tied to why I experienced this game the way I have. And added to that feeling of mine in droves. And that something are the maps. Each and every one is a small work of art, and a thing of beauty, hand-painted with an exorbitant amount of detail. The 2D backgrounds in this game, and the next one, Robin Hood, are a sight to behold. And if you ask me, no map in this genre, 2D or 3D, ever came close to what those two games have to offer. If you played this game, there is a very strong possibility that you can recite from memory every nook and cranny of at least a few missions. And taking into account that there is a total of 25 missions, this means a gargantuan amount of 21 painted masterpieces. That's if I'm counting correctly, because 4 maps repeat, I think. And the amount of variation they were able to put on display is simply astounding to me, especially taking into account that everything takes place in the desert basically. So let's see, there is a canyon, a fortress nested in a secluded valley, which by the way is one of the most stunning places in the game, a hacienda outside town, a rock quarry, or even a military fortress in the middle of the desert, among many others. But much more importantly, the maps themselves, coupled with the joining of new members, provide a steady flow of new elements, so that the gameplay doesn't get stale. After all, there are 25 missions, in which you do basically the same thing over and over again. The way new party members shake up the gameplay is pretty self-explanatory. When a new character joined, I of course wanted to try out their abilities as soon as possible, as they opened up new approaches of eliminating enemies. That's the obvious way to assure that the gameplay loop doesn't get too repetitive. But the developers had another ace up their sleeve, and that's the maps themselves. You see, very many of them have unique characteristics. Some are night mission, like the one where you rescue Kate, where I could hide in the shadows and far easier avoid the gaze of enemies, because of their reduced line of vision. But to balance that out, they pay much more attention to any sound made, and this is applicable to every subsequent night mission. But there are even more specific map characteristics. For example, a little later there is one with a waterfall running through the middle of a small valley. The sound made by falling water can conceal many noises, like gunshots, allowing me to be much more aggressive. Or there is a mission where a battle is going on, or a map with a mine where dynamite is used to blow up rocks. In both cases, no one will pay too much attention to any additional noise, as the guards are used to loud explosions occurring with some regularity. allowing for more liberal use of Sam's dynamite. Conversely, near the end there is a train station where it rains constantly, rendering any explosives useless. These are only some examples how the developers use the maps and setting to breathe new life into the formula from time to time. And as far as the maps are concerned, there is still one more added benefit. Some maps gave me the ability to look into a building by removing part of the roof and or wall. This small procedure gave the developers the ability to present more interesting events and add a new layer of detail to the already phenomenal artwork, as the interiors are even more detailed than the outdoors. There can also be additional conditions placed on a particular mission, like in the Lion's Den where you break into Marshal Jackson's hacienda. Cooper and the gang can't kill anyone, as the people guarding the place are technically on the payroll of a US Marshal and thus protected by the law. Or my personal nightmare, the 9th mission, like a thief in the night, where coincidentally the already mentioned waterfall is. You see, the thing is that I somehow missed the part where Cooper said that I have to steal all the horses and then cut loose the tied up soldier and carry him away, so that it looks like the soldier freed himself and ran off with the horses. And all that without attacking or alerting the enemies by the fire, so that the leader of this group would lead the team to Sanchez's hideout. Imagine my irritation when time after time I tried to clear out the whole map and inevitably the game over screen would appear. Just after a few dozen approaches, I decided to restart the mission, in hope that I just messed up a trigger or something. And then when I listened to Cooper one more time, I finally got what the game wanted from me. But this wasn't the game's fault, just mine for not listening carefully. Be it as it may, this one most definitely seared itself into my mind for many years. So, I must admit, job well done. To show how Spellbound's approach allowed them to make an interesting and coherent game, let us look at one particular mission. One that I already mentioned and that is my favorite mission in the whole game. Fortezza, a high security prison fort where the military keeps Sanchez and Cooper has to break him out. Allow me to explain how I approach this mission. But first, the answer to why Cooper and the gang are even here. You see, as I mentioned in the beginning, Cooper is a bounty hunter in hot pursuit of a train-robbing gang and its leader, and due to some shenanigans he finds out that the guy who he actually caught wasn't the real bad guy here. Well, aside from, you know, being a gang leader and all. And as Cooper still wants to catch the real evil mastermind, he decides to break Sanchez out of prison. That is why he and his team find themselves just outside of the best guarded prison around. In fact, it's more like a fort than a prison. That's sort of beside the point, but very relevant to the mission itself. That's the first component that makes Desperados' story so engaging, and gives me a concrete reason for assaulting a military outpost. Here is also the first time that the team voices their considerable concerns regarding John's plan. Doc and Sam see eye to eye for a change, making their interactions before the mission and the conversation with Sanchez at the end the second component that I talked about. Namely, character interactions and development. The mission itself is set up appropriately in the middle of the night. I must admit, storming such a fortress is already suicide, but little less of one if done by night than in the middle of day. As a result of this, there are shadows everywhere to hide in. And as an added little twist, the soldiers inside the fort have their commanding officers. If they are taken out before making a ruckus, the men will run around like chickens without a head. But if the officers are still present, the prison's defenses will be well coordinated and very likely more difficult to overcome. And here we have a great example of keeping the gameplay fresh. As the location in this mission is a military facility, the addition of a command structure is both a novelty and ultimately makes sense. As sooner no band of outlaws would be able to employ such well coordinated tactics. Plus at the end, Cooper's team will grow by one new compatriot. But let's get to what my approach to this mission was and probably forever will be. I mentioned that the enemy coordination will show itself if I make too much of a noise. Then why not complete the mission stealthily from beginning to end? Well, there is a little problem with that. The main gate. It has to be blown up and that counts as making one hell of a commotion. But I devised a devilishly simple and fun plan. At least for me it was. I'm sure that the soldiers couldn't say the same. I firstly cleaned out the surroundings of the fort and placed Sam's trusty snake at the main gate. and then started shooting in and around the prison. The guards would get alarmed and start running around, and ultimately one of them would go outside, right into my carefully laid trap. After a while, one little snake has decimated the whole fortress. For me, it was a ton of fun luring the soldiers outside to meet their doom at the gate. To be honest, I don't know how popular this approach is, if at all. But that little trap goes to show you that there are many ways to approach a mission. Most of the time, the tactics available are restricted only by the player's imagination, and in the bounds of the provided abilities, of course. This mission is my absolute favorite in the entire game, and it goes without saying that the visuals of the map are as stunning and gorgeous as all the other ones. So here you have the last components that together create a very engaging tactical RTS mission. And Desperados is chock full of them. The game's story is rather simple, but still a lot of fun. It serves as a backdrop way more than the backdrops themselves. The hunt for Sanchez and then El Diablo is just an excuse to visit as many locations as possible. But I must admit they did a wonderful job in making me dislike El Diablo with every fiber of my being. From around mission 8, I believe, when I first laid my eyes on Marshall Jackson, I knew he was up to no good. I mean, is there anyone who thought, oh, here is someone that totally doesn't look like a villain? Still, I didn't know exactly what role he would play, but it was pretty obvious that it wouldn't be anything good. There is something to be said about simple stories that can drive gameplay, serving as an engine for what is presented on the screen. It provides the why to the where for the entire game. And in the end, it was pretty satisfying to stop El Diablo and see him fall to his doom. But that reminds me of the last mission, which was also something of a one-off novelty. I must admit that an honest-to-god boss fight wasn't something that I expected to see in a tactical RTS game, especially taking into account how squishy the main characters are. But this is what I've got, and I can't complain. It was a genius move on the developer's part to end it in such a way. It has its own rhythm and flow, albeit in a very narrow arena. The area itself is also nicely detailed and very cinematic. But the best thing was the feeling of accomplishment after defeating the guy who did so much to screw with me through the whole game. And the amount of moving parts in an otherwise static environment in this mission is also neat. But that brings me to one last point, and it's precisely about those moving parts. You see, the maps themselves are pretty much static, and by that I mean that they don't change through the whole mission. But there are some that have little moving parts. For example, everything that can be blown up by using Sam's TNT, like the Fortezza Gate, the rubble in the canyon, or McCoy's wagon. One could say that this animated destruction is part for the course and nothing special, but they put their minds to show how a gate is destroyed or how a wagon jumps up and falls apart. It's not just a simple image swap covered by a big explosion, but a mini animated event with great attention to detail. And this is not only limited to big explosions, but also to other actions, like cutting down the small rowboat on the steamer while rescuing Kate, or the ability to shoot down the chandelier inside the hacienda in the Lion's Den mission, or even something as small as cutting down a dangling hay ball in the mission where Sam is recruited. The one problem is, as time goes on and I got further and further into the story, these little flourishes appear to get less frequent. But it's a great way to allow the player to utilize the environment, even if only a little. I know that it may seem trivial and insignificant, but I had a blast each time when I could do something with my surroundings, if only to marvel at the quality of those little animations. So here we have a tactical RTS game that, although heavily inspired by the Commandos series, managed to put a unique spin on the formula, producing a very fun and engaging adventure that for many years was the quintessential Western game, at least for me. But how do you follow up such a game? Well, it turns out that you don't follow it up directly at all, but by shifting settings and even the time period to produce something new. That is equally as exciting, but in my opinion a clear, although small step backward when compared to Desperados. Let's dive right into the next game produced by Spellbound, Robin Hood, The Legend of Sherwood. The first thing that hit me right away was the cartoony look of the whole game, making it way more whimsical than its predecessor, giving it a kind of swashbuckling feel, which actually is very appropriate as it is a tale about Robin Hood, and somewhat less serious story than in Desperados. At first I thought that this art style would push me away, but I ended up liking it immensely. It works especially well with the more jokey tone of the entire game. The thing is that this cartoon influence is mostly in the department of character design, as the cities and castles are a little less stylized. I must admit that the setting itself actually took me by surprise. You know, the whole sword and bow adventure. Helping Robin Locksley retake his inheritance and free England from the dastardly rule of Prince John and his henchmen. Well, just now it hit me that this story is actually best suited to be told in a light-hearted and funny tone, as this very simple description brings to mind daring acts of heroism and the image of knights, princesses and tournaments, almost from the get-go. To frame this game in such a way was a perfect choice. And the frame is the most important thing, because I still ended up doing many of the same things as in Desperados. To Spellbound's credit, there were still some new elements and mechanics. But just a moment ago I said that it's a step backwards, so let us talk about why I think that's the case. And in my mind, it's on account of two things. The first one is the reduced amount of abilities available to each party member. Now there are only 3 abilities for each main character, in contrast to the 4 available before. I don't count guns from Desperados, because each character has still a sword, stick, axe or mace. Simply put, a weapon with which to defend oneself in a pinch. And I also don't count the rope ability from Sam, as now tying an opponent up is a simple prompt. So on balance there are 5 abilities less, which greatly impacts the tactics available to the player. Don't get me wrong, the ones that are there are still fun and interesting, like Studley's net throwing, or Scarlet Will's slingshot or his ability to strangle opponents. When I think about it, Will seems to have the most interesting abilities. But this reduced complexity, in my eyes, isn't something that benefits the game in any way. To me, the combination of abilities and finding creative ways of utilizing them is half of the fun in a tactical RTS. It just gives you more options how to dispatch or distract enemies. And yes, I know that there are also additional abilities to the tune of 2 per character for the merry men, but these are only retreads of the ones already possessed by the main cast, so I won't count them here. And although the abilities of those side characters are nothing new, they themselves are a whole new in-game mechanic and will come up later. And the second step back is the amount of available maps. Although they are still small artworks and even more vibrant and full of color than the ones in Desperados, there is one big problem with them, and that is the repetitiveness of some of them. There are 5 main towns or castles, 3 forest locations and Robin's main base of operation. That gives 9 maps in total, which is a far cry from the 21 available in Desperados. But the fact that the maps repeat aren't even the real problem, because to my utter amazement the main missions managed to feel new even when played on an already known terrain. The new objectives, time of day and enemy placement made the whole thing feel fresh, regardless of the map itself. Plus, the maps themselves are even more beautiful than in Desperados, if that's at all possible, and I think they are quite big for the standards set by the previous game. Let me tell you that the castles depicted in Robin Hood are gorgeous and a real treat to marvel at. I just can't put into words how much I liked the level design in this game. And they used one additional trick to make the main missions appear like something new each time, due to the use of beggars and mini-missions available on each particular map. The beggars give valuable information on enemy placement, recent events, or maybe even a hint to a secret that is waiting to be discovered. This approach works surprisingly well to convince the player that even if the map didn't change, then at last time progressed and new things took place in the meantime. Still, there are only 5 main maps and that isn't much in terms of variety, but at least they really tried to make the most out of them. Although one thing really was unexpected for me. There is a surprising amount of verticality, which is a strange thing to say about a 2D environment. But the walls and abundance of roofs in York and Nottingham made it actually feasible to add that layer of verticality. Jumping from roof to roof is oddly satisfying, especially when I didn't want to fight enemies or there were more than I could handle. And it lends itself very well to this game's swashbuckling theme. This jumping around is also available when I wanted to get into the castle in Leicester. Of course, apart from the main gate, which was closed, or the secret passage, which was still undiscovered. Robin can hop from stone to stone and climb over the wall using the vines that grow there. I don't know why, but infiltrating this particular castle was a lot of fun. Actually, this map is my absolute favorite, especially during the day. The colors are vibrant and it just oozes atmosphere. Although this is something that can be said about every map in this game. Maybe with the possible exception of Derby. This one seems to have a perpetual fog cover. There is also an abundance of building cutouts, something that I talked about in Desperados. The places where a portion of the wall and roof disappear to let me peek inside. Even if the total limit of maps is fewer than in the previous game, the amount of those cutouts grew almost exponentially, giving the maps one additional layer of visual splendor, and to some extent even a bit of secrecy and intrigue. Because it is possible, and even very likely, that you won't find every cutout on the first visit, as there can be some small places that will remain hidden from the player if a map is not explored fully. These glimpses inside buildings are also incredibly detailed, standing head and shoulder above the already excellent outdoor design. So, if the main maps are great and full of atmosphere, where is the problem? It's the remaining free forest or ambush maps that turn out to be a big problem and letdown. These maps are not only far smaller than the main ones, but also fewer in number. And that's where most of its problems lie. You see, somewhere in the middle of the game, the developers decided that it would be a great idea to implement an absurd amount of semi-ambush missions on tax collectors and soldiers to pad out the game time. And let me tell you, this wasn't in any way, shape or form a good decision. The concept itself has a solid enough basis, as Robin and the rest of his band have to gather an absurd amount of money to buy the freedom of England's true king, Richard Lionheart, which is a fine goal to work towards, and writes itself very well into the story and legend of Robin Hood. But the process of getting there gets repetitive very fast, very soon. And it isn't even the semi-ambush maps, or goals in on themselves, because executing an ambush from time to time to stop soldier movements or get some money can be a nice distraction and break from the main missions. But the required amount of those missions I had to complete in the second half of the story was way too big, to a point that I dreaded the idea of yet another forest fight with the same enemies and mission objectives. This bogs down the game way too much, almost destroying entirely its pacing. The most interesting thing is that this problem has an easy solution, at least to me. Just make more forest maps. As they are smaller, this shouldn't be that big of a problem. Or if the budget was stretched to its absolute limit, put way more money or possibilities to inhibit the enemy in main missions, giving the player even more stuff to do while playing them, and leaves the ambushes only as flavor to sprinkle in from time to time to liven up the gameplay, taking out completely the requirement to replay them again and again. I mentioned that you not only rob tax collectors and convoys, but also inhibit the enemy army movements, which is a late game mechanic, when Robin has to conquer towns or castles from Prince John and his men. The liberation process in itself is a rather fun and engaging activity, especially when from time to time Robin gets the opportunity to fight one of Prince John's men, which is always nice, not only because of the fencing mechanics, but also due to the dialogue just before the fight, and the feeling that they finally will get what they deserve. But the run-up to this may require more forest missions, which is mildly irritating. Because, you see, to prepare for an assault you have to gather a set amount of shields, which determine how difficult any given castle will be to storm. It's simple, the more shields Robin accumulates, the less challenging an assault will be. Those shields are also needed to prevent an enemy siege on already conquered castles. I had to win anywhere from 3 to about 8 shields for each defense or siege. The problem is that many of them can be won during those aforementioned forest missions, to the tune of 1 shield per mission. I think you start to see the problem here. It means forest mission after forest mission, just to be able to progress the story a tiny bit forward. But to be fair, shields can also be bought with money. It's true that money itself can be found during main missions, but if you want to spend it in greater amount, you will have to get it during the same forest ambushes, and believe me, you will burn through gold at an alarming rate if you decide to buy all the shields with money. To me, this repetitive fallback on these missions was a big misstep. especially that the main tasks provided a satisfying amount of game time. There is lastly one other possibility to earn shields. That is to send the merry men on missions, which brings me neatly to another new interesting mechanic. The game keeps tally of how much people Robin and his group killed during its run. That counter is very important, as it decides how many new members will the group acquire. The more bloody you operate, the less people will be willing to join the group. This little design choice directly impacted how I played the game, but also in a very concrete way showed that the world reacts to what you are doing. Think about it. Why would the subjects of Prince John join Robin if he is far more bloody than their current king-to-be? It seems that they would rather start seeing the hero as a thieving terrorist hiding in the bushes, murdering everyone in his path, making Prince John's propaganda way easier than it should be. But if some merry men join Robin, they are not only additional muscle you can bring on missions, but also can be used as craftsmen, producing useful items in the band's camp. Everything that is utilized by the character's abilities can be put together in the camp. If you leave your recruits in a designated area and go on a main story mission, when you get back they will have produced a set amount of items that can be picked up and used. They can also be trained in archery and melee combat. But those new members have one more useful application. They can be sent on missions to earn additional shields for a castle assault. But this can have two drawbacks as I see it. The meeting that Robin orders before sending them out disrupts all the production allocation I had going on in the base, which is infuriating at times. Additionally, some of them may die and never get back to base, so I was always very reluctant to send them on such assignments. But if you play basically without killing anyone, it is possible to gather such a ridiculous amount of them that you won't even feel the difference if they don't come back from a mission. Still, this is a very interesting way of showing how the game world reacts to player choices, and for me it was a first in a tactical RTS. I almost forgot about something that I mentioned in passing that warrants an explanation. And I'm talking about the mini-quests available during main missions. Robin gets the chance to help various denizens of the realm, mostly by doing some very basic tasks, like rescuing someone from aggressive soldiers or finding the whereabouts of a missing son. These are short tasks and not especially complicated, but add a layer of things that can be done during any given main mission. And they serve as a great tool for world building, telling the stories of normal people that happen to live under Prince John's rule and the iron fist of the Sheriff of Nottingham, rounding out the player's understanding of what is going on in the streets and cities of the kingdom. Because the question as to why this oppression is going on is answered mostly during the main quests. I was eavesdropping on the evildoers, listening to what they intend to do, and then witnessing the consequences of their decisions in a very tangible way, reflected in the lives of their subjects, giving the world believability. You see, Prince John wants to be crowned king, so he uses his allies, the Sheriff of Nottingham, Guy Gisborne and Scatlock, to put the squeeze to the citizens of the realm. Robin's goal is to throw wrenches into those designs, in addition to building alliances and taking back the kingdom. But he doesn't have to do this all by himself. He has the help of Studley, Marion, Little John, Frere Tuck and Scarlet Will. Each of those characters has a unique personality. My personal favorite is Will, with the greatest weapon of all, his flail, which can be used to easily dispatch even heavily armored opponents. Not to mention that this weapon has the ability to knock the enemy out without killing him. He can also strangle people, which comes in handy in later stages of the game. But all the characters together make for a very fun company, and there is much fun to be had by listening to the conversation that Robin has with them, even if the amount of them is not as great as in Desperados, which may be due to the fact that I could choose who goes on any given mission. There are of course critical characters and abilities for most main missions, and that means Robin more often than not, as well as the ability to tie someone up, for example. But the fact that there was any choice available at all is a major innovation, although I struggle to say if it was an improvement. On one side, it's nice to be able to choose my squad on any given mission, but on the other hand, as my team may contain any number of character combinations, it was virtually impossible for the developers to know who I will pick and plan the dialogues accordingly. Greater gameplay freedom in this case resulted in lessening of fun character interactions, which is an substantial loss, at least for me. I would in a heartbeat change a dynamic party for a static team if it meant more in-party dialogues. That's the path the developers chose, trying to provide more freedom to the player. It's just a shame that the dialogue suffered for it. But there is one more small neat thing when it comes to the story. The prince tries to gather all crowning jewels needed for the coronation, and Robin, seeing as he is an outlaw, in some missions can steal those jewels from the prince's men and store them in Robin's hideout. They don't do anything really, but are a nice collectible that makes sense and is justified in the game's story. Plus, it gives one more goal during those missions when they are available, but are by no means necessary to acquire. And if the player finds them all, there will be a small cutscene at the end commemorating this momentous achievement, which by itself is a nice little present from the developers. And the way they sit around the main tree in Robin's hideout spinning around is a nice visual. Plus the little text that sit beside them that give additional information. And there are also the reactions of Prince John when he finds out that something was stolen. I must admit that seeing what Prince John has to say when he sees they're missing was one of the primary drivers for collecting those jewels. Finally, we have one last thing that is quite unique when it comes to Robin Hood. That is fencing. Honest to God fencing. And one of the better ones ever portrayed in a game. If one of your characters gets him or herself into close combat, they will use their main weapon to defend themselves. If left alone, their fight with the enemy will have varying degrees of competency to them, depending in most part on their prowess in melee combat. But if you take control of the fight, you can tell the character what attack to perform by drawing a shape with a cursor. There is stabbing, swinging, blocking and a roundhouse attack. The shapes you have to draw for each are pretty intuitive. There is also a special move available to each character, performed if you draw the infinity symbol, which is rather powerful, well, the attack is not the symbol, and deals a lot of damage, in addition to a special animation. The one drawback is that it takes way more time to execute than a normal attack. My personal favorite in this case is the move performed by Freyr attack. It just sucks that it has a very close range. This fencing is a fantastic mechanic, at least for me, and can be used to great effect, not only when you try to defeat enemies in close combat, but for example also to tie down a large group of opponents while Studley prepares his net. With that said, I had the most fun facing any of the main antagonists in a one-on-one duel. The best example of this is the mission in York, where Marion is forced to marry Guy Gisborne. And I don't have to tell you that this isn't something that Robin can allow. So he confronts Guy and challenges him to a duel. The ensuing fight was a lot of fun, attacking and blocking while searching the whole time for an opening to deal the final blow. But the fight itself shows one more thing that the fencing system allowed the developers to do. They can plan out cinematic fights where the player is in absolute control. Something like the last mission in Desperados. Maybe not so intricate, but much more frequent. It's a great moment during gameplay, equally tense and satisfying. Well, that is as long as you don't know how to defeat absolutely any enemy in the game in a matter of seconds by swinging frantically from left to right. No soldier or knight is able to withstand that barrage, even on horseback. If you know that trick, then no one can stop you, with the possible exception of archers. Those guys can be infuriating. This way of fighting was so overpowered that most of the time I consciously prevented myself from using it, as I derive most enjoyment from dispatching the enemies stealthily. Although it turned out to be a godsend in the forest missions, as I wanted to be finished with them as soon as possible. If you look past the small frustrations caused by the repeating forest missions, Robin Hood is a very good game, providing a lot of fun, especially taking into account the new mechanics it implements. There is also the not so small matter of an interesting, engaging story. In that regard, it presents the same high standard of Desperados. It's just a pity that the developers decided that they need to artificially pad out the game time. Maybe if there were more ambush locations or kinds of mission objectives in the woods, this wouldn't be so deeply felt. But as it stands now, it slows down the whole game and can even lead some people to put it down during that time, to never pick it back up again. And that's a damn shame, because almost everything else is great, especially the sword fights. To me, this was a solid effort at creating something new and fresh with only few missteps. And never before was there a game that allowed me to feel like Robin Hood and gave the ability to actually lead the merry men. Plus, I really fell in love with the map design. But there is still one more game released by Spellbound in the 2D isometric style of Robin Hood and Desperados, and that is Chicago 1930. This time they take us to Chicago. Yeah, I know, surprising given the title. Between the years 1928 and 1932, at the height of the prohibition in the USA. So, let's take a look at why prohibiting people access to something isn't always the best idea, and dive into the last 2D Tactical RTS by Spellbound. I must admit, this is a very rich environment for storytelling. There is a metric ton of material to draw from, both historic and fictional. The propensity for betrayal, gunfights and all kinds of mafia and police shenanigans was enormous. Especially that the game itself doesn't do away with the more cartoony presentation of its immediate predecessor, so it can be used to smooth over the more violent edges of that time period, allowing it to be more accessible. And even with all this potential, I still think that this game out of the three is the weakest one by a wide margin. In Chicago 1930, I could experience the story from two different angles, from the side of the mafia and the police. It isn't the same time frame though. Chronologically, the first one is the story of Barretto, a mob enforcer from the year 1928 to 1930, and then followed up by the story of Edward Nash, an FBI agent, from 1930 to 1932. I had to play both paths to get the whole picture, and I must admit, this is a fun and pretty unique way to experience the story, even though this game wasn't in any way the first one to do that. Still, that is a neat idea. But even if the frame is interesting and promises much, the execution leaves lots to be desired. And that's a very strange thing, because the developer, on paper, gave the player way more ways to approach a mission, with mixing and matching different abilities and squad members. If you ask me, exactly here lies the greatest problem of this game. The multitudes of choices makes the narrative suffer. So let's dive right into Chicago and see what I mean by that. The first and most strange change is that they did away with the team consisting of unique and interesting characters. Instead, I had one main guy for each storyline respectively, and then tons and tons of undescript mobsters and policemen. While in the mob story it makes perfect sense, as the mafia isn't terribly concerned if any of the foot soldiers survive any given mission. The only people that are important and have any kind of meaning are the ones at the top, that is Barretto and Falcone. But in the FBI storyline it's a little more difficult to justify, because mechanically the policemen don't differ in any way from the mob. I think that in this case, rather than in quantity, they should go into quality, by giving the police a unique squad with abilities that would freshen up the gameplay and also send a strong message that one of those organizations viewed their members as far more expendable. As it stands now, there are only two playable characters that have any kind of meaning, plus the police commissioner and Don Falcone. Those two always give the mission briefing. But what the developers try to convey, if anything at all, is the least of the problems presented by this approach to team composition. I can mix and match any number of characters for the team. The one prerequisite is that Barretto or Nash are in the party depending on the storyline. That means that any and all tension between party members is thrown right out of the window. There isn't any party dialogue, because there can't be. Not if every character is a random guy with random stats, look and name. The devs couldn't design any dialogue lines, because at their own hand they created a party dynamic that doesn't allow for that. And in my mind, it's a great and unnecessary loss. Well, maybe not that unnecessary, as I assume that there were significant savings when it comes to writers and voice actors. But it definitely resulted in a much duller product. Even if they didn't want to hire as many voice actors, they simply could go the route of the first two Commandos games, where there was minimal voice work, but the characters themselves were distinct and very memorable. This also wasn't possible, as each team member can use absolutely any tool available. The only difference is their proficiency with them. There is admittedly an impressive array of weapons, but they don't feel as distinct as the abilities from Desperados or Robin Hood. There is no net throwing, or even some snakes or Mia's blowpipe. Most of them are guns, clubs or knives. To put it simply, they are mostly measures of direct coercion. All of the previous abilities have a unique feel to them and are way more fun. But to be fair, there is a nice mechanic when it comes to those weapon abilities, or rather the way you acquire them. Each mission that had a weapon market that I completed unlocked new guns, so I could in a very limited way prioritize what district to take over next, if I wanted new toys for my men. But as I said, the choice of missions is very limited, because there are only maybe 2 that I could choose from at any given time. To me, if they wanted to implement such a system of acquiring new abilities, weapons or information, it should be way more freeform so that I could mix and match, or prioritize one specific thing that I wanted to achieve, like having the Tommy gun very early on, or being able to better train my men, although that could negatively affect the storytelling. But with the small amount of story available during my hunt for the Baron, this isn't even a problem. Just leave breadcrumbs of information in each mission, so the whole picture reveals itself once you finish them all. It wouldn't be much different than it is right now, just with the added benefit of actually being able to perform any mission from the get-go. And here is another problem that was somewhat foreshadowed in Robin Hood, that is the amount of available maps. They still look quite decent, even though they are definitely a step down from the 2 previous games. There are only 8 of them, and none lives up to the splendor of Leicester or any other castle, and both playthroughs as the mob and FBI use the same places. Although the sensation of going through them on the other side of the barricade can be a fine experience, showing the different methods of approaching problems. Still, that mostly depended on my playstyle, because while playing as the police I tried to use non-lethal force as much as possible, in contrast to my mob playthrough. Both sides of the conflict can also use a neat mechanic that allows to intimidate NPCs by aiming a gun at them. They will put their hands up and you can search them, or sometimes get some useful info out of them. I must admit, it fits the genre very well. My only problem was that I tended to try and search them with the same guy that held them at gunpoint, and as soon as I put my gun away, they either bolted or took out a weapon and attacked me. But this is wholly on me, as this system works as intended. There is one thing that the game encourages and more importantly gives a solid reason for. It hit me just as I left the warehouse in the docks after I finished off Falcone's competitor O'Neill. If you think about mafia movies, what are the things that immediately come to mind? Booze, cops, and above all else, gunfights and their immediate aftermath. And this is what hit me after I left the docks. There were bodies everywhere, and all of it was my doing. I could of course try to knock everyone out, but most enemies are clustered so close together that it's far easier to mow them down with a Tommy gun or a shotgun than to try to knock them out. Without even me knowing, I inadvertently slipped into a mafia mode of dealing with problems. The most incredible thing, at least for me, was that this wasn't really conscious on my part, as in these types of games I try to take everybody down, if not non-lethally, then at least as quiet as possible. But this game encourages in a very subtle way a brutal and loud approach, because I certainly could do it the hard way. But why bother if the more direct approach works perfectly well and gets the job done? It perhaps showed me, way more than I wish to admit, how easy it can be to slip into that easy mode in life, if given the opportunity with little consequences from the law enforcement. But as always, there is a price to pay, mostly in paranoia and with one's life, as Barretto will ultimately find out. Still, it was a great gameplay moment and one that I didn't expect. The only problem is that as the police, I could do pretty much the same thing, and the game didn't punish me for such violent approach. And I would understand if it came to a shootout at a mob hideout or even casino. But a public place like a train station should have its own rules for the police and for acting in such obviously violent way. There should be a difference between those two storylines, in the approach to human life and the rule of law. And I know, being a policeman is in most cases very difficult and often violent. They are there to uphold the law, not to be another mafia group, only this time sanctioned by the government. The one difference is that the police has to wait for the enemy to display hostile intent. But that was not enough to change my behavior, especially that provoking the mobsters is extremely easy. There should at least be a more direct and concrete incentive to abide by the law, to funnel me into a less lethal approach. Maybe by placing the enemies in a more interesting way, so that there is at least a path to knock them out. Or by giving the police more pacifistic abilities. As it is now, there really isn't much difference between the mob and the FBI, at least in the gameplay department. And I know that you can say that the police had to be as brutal as they were to fight the mafia. But still, there always was at least the underlying understanding that they have to uphold the rule of law, and that is their ultimate mission, not mowing down everyone in their path. Let's shift gears and talk about the story. The main story in this game is not only to take over the city, but also to hunt down the Baron, someone that is embezzling money from Don Falcone. I bounce from mission to mission searching for his identity with some red herrings along the way, to find out at the end that it was Barretto the whole time, which is a decent enough twist, even though it comes out of nowhere. I do feel that there should be more hints while, are playing as the mob controlling him. Don't get me wrong, it makes absolute sense that the guy one step from the top is the traitor, but there is almost nothing that points to him, even for a very perceptive player. And while we are at the topic of information, most of the story beats and mission info was given to me via text, which is to say the least unsatisfying, and a step back even from Robin Hood. On one hand, it's fun to crack open a mystery by talking to people on the scene, gathering clues and information. On the other hand though, it feels very low budget, and I don't even mean the lack of voice acting, although that is also upsetting, but much more that there seems to be only one true way to finish an assignment. By that I mean that I had more times than not talked to a certain NPC in a certain order to progress. I admit that this is a pretty normal procedure, but there were many occasions that I was running through the whole map because I missed an NPC hidden in a closet somewhere that the game absolutely insisted that I have to talk to. To me, it just feels way too stifling, especially when the game itself puts so much emphasis on choice when it comes to party composition and my team's loadout. Although surprisingly, this approach to story presentation has its bright sides, and that is best seen while playing as the FBI. This part of the conflict lends itself well to gathering clues and inspecting crime scenes. Especially the first mission was a lot of fun, where you try to sort out the mess that Barretto and Falcone left after them, by uncovering clues to a murder in a hotel suite. Combing through the rooms in search of clues and questioning the witnesses is actually a lot of fun, way more than I thought it would be. Step by step uncovering parts of the truth, getting access to previously closed off rooms and stumbling on hidden clues. The game's frame and mechanics lend themselves very well to that kind of police work. The one other mission that really stands out is the one where the police is rescuing hostages while the mafia keeps them at gunpoint and will shoot them if I make too much of a noise. It's unique, plays to the FBI's strengths and is ultimately quite fun. And this is and could be the stuff that makes the police storyline different and more engaging, if only the devs would use them way more often. It was a very strange step for the developers to discard almost all of the things that made Desperados and Robin Hood such good and fun games. They reduced the amount of maps with different, unique properties to them that allowed the gameplay to stay fresh for a very long time. They substituted a well-rounded team of very distinct individuals, each with their own talents, for a big amorphous blob of samey pawns with ultimately the same abilities, their only distinction being how well each of them can handle the tools at their disposal. This game would probably be much more fun and distinct if the mafia part pretty much remained just like it is, with tons of bodies lining the streets after a gunfight, and with little regard for human life. But the police could be made different and way more interesting by giving them a distinct team of dedicated professionals, all with their own unique abilities, and the emphasis on upholding the rule of law being as bloodless as possible. I know that it would probably be way more work for the developers, but this approach could yield a better story and gameplay. As it is now, to me, this is an enormous step back from where they started. It's like one of those YouTube videos where someone shows how their skills in drawing improved over time, but run backwards. And don't get me wrong, I don't think that it's a step backwards just because this game isn't what I wish it was. I'm just looking for ways to improve it and make it more interesting. It feels, if not unfinished, then at least rushed, with a good idea and frame, but a simple and lackluster execution. Which is really strange because based on their previous work, I know that they can create an interesting, engaging game with a nice story and great gameplay. But it is what it is. To me, this one is the weakest work from Spellbound when it comes to the 2D isometric tactical RTS games. So, there you have it, all 3 games. And as you can probably tell, for me the first one, Desperados Wanted Dead or Alive, is the best one, taking the core mechanics from the Commandos series and improving on them, with an actual story, interesting characters and gorgeous maps. Followed up by Robin Hood, which is no doubt a solid performance. There are unique new mechanics and the maps are even more beautiful, vibrant and full of detail than previously, with lots of building cutouts, but also with reduced abilities and less character interactions. Culminating with the weakest of those 3, Chicago 1930. But even if I think that the last one is the lowest effort, there is still fun to be had with that one, just not as much as with the previous titles. So that is my complete in-depth look at Spellbound's tactical 2D RTS games. And yes, I know that there are still 2 more games from them, Eldorado and Cooper's Revenge. And I actually debated if I should include them in this video, but I ultimately decided against it. I thought it best to concentrate only on the 2D works from Spellbound. This is all. If you are listening to this, then thank you for holding out for such a long time. And if you like this video, considering sharing and engaging. And maybe we'll see us again in the next in-depth look.